Hi, this week we're talking about the women's movement. Really, we're talking about Margaret Sanger, who is the founding mother of Planned Parenthood and an advocate for birth control. But she is just one person, one aspect out of a long history of women fighting for their rights that dates back to more or less the first day that patriarchy appeared historically. And of course, if we do want to go back to the earliest origins, what is patriarchy? Ultimately, it is the power of property owning husbands over their wives. And the reason that it is important to have monogamous marriage once you get men who own property is because once you have property, you have an inheritance. If you have an inheritance, you want to know who your children are and thereby who your heirs are. And you can't tell outside of monogamy and before you get genetic testing and paternity tests who the father is. You can only ever tell who the mother is for sure. So for that reason, exclusive control over the reproductive functions of one woman by one man, in other words, monogamous marriage, becomes thinkable, becomes functional at the point when you have property ownership. That is to say, once people begin to farm, to settle down, and then rather than to do this communally, to put up fences and to say this is the property owned by one person to the exclusion of everybody else. So the reason I'm telling you this is because it shows you not just the origins of patriarchy, because at that point, the law, the customs, the religious systems, everything, the gender roles starts to be designed to justify that subservient role of women as wives, sometimes one wife to the husband, sometimes more, depending on the tribe, of one man. But what it also tells you, beyond the earliest origins of mankind, is the economic aspect that is inherent to gender relations. So gender is not just a category that is about biology. In fact, very little of it is about biology. The ascription of an inferior nature to women operates on the given of biology, of gendered biology, where part of the species is male and the other part is female, and this has a role to play for the reproduction of our species. But that mere fact in itself carries very little cultural significance inherently. So the reason that we have genders and that this is significant for making a difference between people and their rights under the law, under customs and culture and religion and so forth, is because property ownership makes that function. So over the course of the past 200 years, make it 250 years, since the Age of Revolution came around with the American Revolution in 1776 and the French Revolution in 1789, and people started proclaiming the universal rights of man, this became a question. And in English, this is more problematic because you have the word man, which is about the male gender, and it is also the word for the genus, that is to say, the species. In there, it includes men and women. It is easier in German, where you have the male gender, Mann, same as the English man. The female gender for woman is Frau. And then you have a third term, which is for both of them, and that's Mensch. And that's neither nor, it's both, rather. So when the universal rights of man were proclaimed, it is easy to misunderstand that in English to mean just the rights of the males of the species. But of course, when they said man at the time, they meant the genus, they meant men and women equally. In German, where this is translated not as Männerrechte, rights of biological males, but Menschenrechte, rights of humanity, it is much clearer. So in English, you have to explain it. And there is doubt based on that, where people say, oh, it was never meant for women. It was only for white men. No, it is inherently meant for people in general when they say rights of man. And yet, because of the tenacity of customs, especially the Christian tradition, where Eve is saddled with being the source of all evil, the first woman messed everything up, according to a certain reading of the story of the expulsion of Adam and Eve from paradise, the moment of original sin. It's all the woman whose disobedience to God, to the father of the household, was what messed everything up, because she ate the apple and she shouldn't have. And that's how people got knowledge of good and evil before they were innocent. Anywho, I'm sure you knew this, but what I'm saying here is, from the beginnings of the age of revolution, where the basis, where the foundation for societies now is all people have rights and they have equal rights. The question was, is this for women too? And then, of course, in a related question, is it also for people who aren't white? But at the very origin, in the age of Mary Wollstonecraft, the English feminist, or Abigail Adams, the American feminist and presidential wife, the question of the rights of women had to be about property rights from the beginning. Women were covered under the law of coverture at this time, meaning that once they entered marriage, they had no legal existence apart from their husband. They were covered under the law by their husband. The only person who is a full subject of the law is the person who owns property. Not surprising, considering that, say, 90% or more of the law is concerned with property ownership and what happens with the property. So if you don't have property, what's the point of being interested in the law? And because they're not full legal subjects, women don't get to vote. So they don't get to vote because they're women. They don't not get to vote because they're women. They don't get to vote because they are non-property owners. And the reason they can't own property is because they're wives. And under the law of coverture, wives don't own property. But this puts them in the same boat in the United States as slaves, as well as 80% of white men who are not property owners. So they don't get the right to vote either. However, they are considered citizens. And with women, that's a shaky distinction. It makes it easier for men to gain the right to vote later once the right to vote is separated from property ownership. But in most states where the constitutions are changed in the 1810s and 1820s in the United States, the moment that men get to have the right to vote, regardless of whether they're property owners, the constitutions then start to say that actually voting rights are only for white people and only for men, to the exclusion of non-whites and to the exclusion of women. So we're taking away the property qualification that used to keep these two groups away from the polls. But we want to keep those two groups away from the polls in the future, so we're going to put it in explicitly. So women actually lost some rights they had previously had in the process of democratizing the United States. And this democracy didn't work against women everywhere. It's kind of specific for the US, where it's a white man's democracy. In many other places, it went hand in hand. And yet, from this point onward, still, the question of whether women have rights remains a question of whether they have opportunities, what they can they speak in public? Can they have a voice? Comes down to the question of, do they have the autonomy? And this is often defined in economic terms. Can they afford to? Or will the husband kick them to the curb and leave them destitute to speak their mind? Can they speak their mind without the approval of the husband? Many, many things women didn't used to be able to do without their husband's approval. Ask your grandparents. Wives needed the signature of their husband to get a driver's license, to take a job, to get a credit card. And when they did get a credit card, it was not in their own name, it was as Mrs. name of your husband here. So all these things speak to a subservient and subordinate role of women in the economy. If you look at subsequent waves of feminism, of attempts to gain equal status in the law and in the labor market for women. It happens at times when women have increased economic opportunity. Case in point, in the 1840s, you have the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. And the 1840s was the decade when the law of coverture was scrapped in the US. And from that point onward, women were allowed to own property independently of their husbands. You could have a prenuptial agreement and bring your property into the marriage and keep it. And lo and behold, 3 years later, you have the beginnings of a women's movement. Now, for Margaret Sanger in the 1920s, the point is here that so many young women at this point find employment opportunity because the new economy of menial secretarial work, people with typewriters, that is gendered. The secretary, the typist is female. The new technology of the day, the telephone system, which still at this point requires staffed relay stations. You can't just dial your way from your home phone to wherever you want. You pick up the phone, you talk to a person who then physically plugs a cord from your line into the next line that'll take your call to the next relay station. And they have to talk to the next person down the line all the way to the final recipient of your phone call. And these jobs, the telephone central operators, are also young women. In the textile industry, industrial employment is growing. And this is also a line of work that is gendered and that women tend to get. So in many other fields too, the shop girl, which goes back to the 1860s in the department store, but it expands exponentially in the 1920s, is gendered, is gendered female. So in these professions where women are helpers, they're not in charge, but they're doing the necessary busy work that gets the machines running, the typewriters, the telephones, everything that serious businessmen need to conduct serious business. The gears are oiled, are greased by women in this. And they are taking home salaries for that, so they don't have to get married to the first guy who comes and asks for their hand, and they don't have to have children right away. And that makes possible for somebody like Margaret Sanger to say, we can redefine marriage and we can redefine having children. This can be a conscious decision based on love. And that means that people are going to be less likely to be impoverished because they work together, they trust each other, they bring up only as many children as they can afford. As a result of that, these children are going to be happier, better adjusted, better educated. And then finally, again, to continue down the same line of argument, economic opportunity for women translates into expanded rights and expanded demands for rights. In the 1960s, when educational opportunities were expanded in the United States, many more women were able to go to college and were looking for jobs that matched their intellectual ability and their professional training. And while it remained a problem that women were vastly overeducated for the kinds of jobs that they were getting, nevertheless, the sense had been created that women can have a career as a professional, not just as somebody who helps men be professionals, but as somebody who's in charge, who's inventing things, who's making things go, who's in a managerial position or is the boss. So that next wave of feminism in the 1960s and 1970s is certainly based on this expansion of economic opportunities. So if the group that presents this week wants to take a crack at any of these aspects, they can certainly set the emphasis the way they like. But this is basically the framework I want you to keep in mind. In the last instance, this is a question of how the reproduction of the species is organized. And that means both the labor of having and raising children, and it means also, more broadly speaking, work and how people make a living, and what that has to do with the division of labor between the sexes, or for that matter, between the genders. So that's my introduction for this week, and I'm looking forward to having this discussion with everybody.